They laughed at me for buying 50 plots of land near a bank. 12 years later, they were shocked. My name is Harold Thompson, and 12 years ago, nearly everybody in Hartwell County thought I had finally lost my mind. Now, by that point, I'd already spent more than 40 years farming. I'd survived droughts that cracked the ground open like broken pottery. I'd survived floods that swallowed entire fields overnight. I'd survived low crop prices, high fuel prices, and enough bad weather to write a book about disappointment. So when people started calling me crazy, it wasn't exactly the worst thing I'd ever been called. But I will admit this. Even I understood why they were laughing. Because on paper, what I did made absolutely no sense. I spent nearly every dollar I had saved over 20 years buying 50 small plots of land surrounding an old community bank that most people believed wouldn't even stay open another 5 years. The bank sat on the edge of town beside a 2-lane highway and a collection of aging buildings whose best days were long behind them. Paint peeled from storefronts. Empty windows stared out toward the road. Weeds pushed through cracks in sidewalks. Half the businesses had already closed their doors. The gas station across the road had been abandoned for so long that vines were growing through the fuel pumps. Most folks looked at that part of town and saw decline. I looked at it and saw something else. Opportunity. The first plot cost me less than a used pickup truck. The second wasn't much more expensive. By the time I purchased my 10th plot, people started paying attention. By the 20th, they started talking. By the 30th, they started laughing. And by the time I reached 50 plots, I had become the county's favorite joke. Every morning at the diner, somebody had a new comment. Harold's buying dirt nobody wants. Must be planning to grow concrete. Maybe he's starting the world's smallest farm. The room would erupt in laughter. I usually laughed with them, not because I agreed, because there was no point arguing. You see, there are two kinds of people in this world. People who look at what something is today, and people who look at what it might become tomorrow. I had spent my entire life watching land change value. Farmland becoming neighborhoods. Cow pastures becoming shopping centers. Quiet roads becoming major highways. Land never stays the same forever. That's something farmers understand better than most people. We're always thinking seasons ahead, sometimes years ahead. And 12 years earlier, I had noticed something nobody else seemed interested in. Every month, tucked away in the back pages of county records, were discussions about future transportation projects. Nothing official, nothing exciting, just proposals, studies, surveys, possibilities. Most people ignored them. I didn't, because those papers kept mentioning the same area, the area around that little bank. At first I thought it was coincidence. Then I noticed something else. Utility companies were quietly buying easements nearby. Survey crews appeared along roadsides. Engineers occasionally stopped by town meetings. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make headlines. Just small clues, tiny pieces of a puzzle. And every piece pointed in the same direction. Growth was coming. Not next year. Not even 5 years later. But eventually. The problem was patience. Most people want investments that reward them immediately. Land doesn't work that way. Land rewards patience. And patience is becoming rare. So while everybody else laughed, I kept buying. One plot, then another, then another. There were nights I couldn't sleep. Nights I wondered if maybe they were right. Nights I sat on my porch staring into darkness wondering if I'd spent my retirement on a foolish dream. Because that's the part people never talk about. Every successful investment spends years looking like a mistake. Nobody celebrates you during those years. Nobody congratulates you. They only notice after it works. And for a long time, it looked like I had made the worst decision of my life. The buildings around the bank kept aging. Businesses kept closing. The area looked worse every year. People became even more confident that I'd failed. Then came year 8. And that's when things started changing. One afternoon, I noticed survey stakes appearing along the highway, bright orange markers driven into the ground. Most people ignored them. My heart nearly stopped when I saw them, because I knew what they meant. Construction planning. Real planning. Not rumors. Not studies. The real thing. A few months later, the official announcement finally arrived. A major highway expansion project. New commercial zoning. Infrastructure investment. Utility upgrades. Development corridors. The entire area surrounding that old bank had suddenly become one of the most strategically important locations in the county. I still remember reading the newspaper article. My coffee nearly spilled across the table. Not because I was surprised, because after waiting 8 years, I finally knew I wasn't crazy. The town reacted differently. The same people who laughed now wanted details, questions, advice, information. But the biggest shock was still ahead. Within 2 years, developers started arriving. Then investors. Then construction companies. Then retail groups. Everybody wanted land. And that's when they discovered something. I owned most of it, 50 plots, surrounding the bank from nearly every direction. The same land nobody wanted. The same land everybody mocked. The same land they called worthless. Suddenly became the most valuable property in town. Offers started arriving weekly, then daily. The numbers became so large I thought there had to be mistakes. Developers competed against one another. Commercial projects expanded. Land values exploded. And the old farmer everybody laughed at suddenly found himself sitting across conference tables negotiating deals worth more money than he had imagined possible. But here's the funny thing. The money wasn't my favorite part. What I enjoyed most was driving past the diner every morning. Not to brag, not to gloat, but because the same men who once laughed now sat quietly reading newspapers filled with stories about the development they never saw coming. 12 years. That's how long I waited. 12 years of doubt. 12 years of jokes. 12 years of wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. Then one day the future arrived. Exactly where I thought it would. And when people ask me today how I knew, I always give them the same answer. I didn't know. Not for certain. Nobody ever knows for certain. I simply paid attention when everybody else stopped looking. And maybe that's the lesson hidden inside this story. Opportunity rarely arrives wearing a sign. Most of the time it looks boring, ordinary, unimpressive. Most people walk right past it. Sometimes it's an old field. Sometimes it's a forgotten road. And sometimes it's 50 little plots of land beside a struggling bank that everybody thinks is worthless. If you've enjoyed my story, subscribe and share the video. Because the next time people laugh at someone's dream, remember this: the crowd usually notices success after it happens. The person who succeeds sees it years before everyone else does. The part nobody knew was that I wasn't really buying those 50 plots for myself. At least not entirely. You see, by the time I started buying that land, I was already 67 years old. Most men my age were thinking about slowing down. Some had sold their farms. Others had moved closer to town. Many spent their afternoons sitting on porches talking about what they used to do. But every evening, when the sun disappeared behind the fields, I would walk out to the old cemetery on the edge of town. And every evening, I would stop beside one particular grave. My wife's. Her name was Margaret. She had been gone for almost 10 years when I bought the first plot. 10 years. Yet there wasn't a day I didn't think about her. Margaret was the one who taught me patience. When crops failed, she told me another season would come. When prices crashed, she reminded me markets recover. When droughts arrived, she reminded me rain eventually follows. And when she was dying, she made me promise something. She made me promise I wouldn't spend the rest of my life being afraid. Afraid of risk. Afraid of failure. Afraid of what people might think. So when everyone laughed at me for buying those plots, I heard her voice. The same voice I'd heard 1,000 times before. Let them laugh, Harold. And so I did. Because dreams don't need permission from crowds. When the development finally exploded and the land became valuable, people assumed I would sell everything. Many expected me to buy a mansion, a luxury car, some extravagant lifestyle. Instead, I did something that confused everyone. I sold only part of the property. The rest I placed into a family trust. Then I funded scholarships for local farm kids. Not because I wanted recognition, because I remembered being young. I remembered how difficult it was to get started. I remembered how many dreams die simply because nobody gives them a chance. Within a few years, dozens of students had received help. Some became farmers. Some became engineers. Some became veterinarians. One even returned home and opened a business in the very development built on land people once called worthless. That was the moment I finally understood something. The land had never been the treasure. The money had never been the treasure. The treasure was what the opportunity allowed me to do for other people. A few years ago, I walked past the old bank again. The building still stands there, but everything around it has changed. Restaurants, shops, offices, families, life. The place that once looked forgotten is now one of the busiest parts of the county. Sometimes people still recognize me. Some laugh and tell the story of how I bought 50 plots nobody wanted. Others ask how I knew. But the question I get most often is this: what did it feel like when everyone realized you were right? And honestly, that wasn't the best part. The best part was proving that patience still matters. The best part was showing that opportunity often hides where nobody is looking. The best part was knowing that every joke, every insult, every doubt became fuel that kept me moving forward. Today, I'm an old man, older than I was when this story began. The fields don't call my name as loudly as they once did. My hands aren't as strong. My steps aren't as fast. But every now and then, I sit on a bench overlooking the town and watch the traffic move through the development that grew from those 50 forgotten plots. And I think about how close I came to listening to the crowd. How close I came to giving up. How close I came to believing the laughter. If I had listened, none of it would have happened. Not the success. Not the scholarships. Not the opportunities. Not the future. And that's why I want to leave you with this. Sometimes the difference between a foolish decision and a brilliant one is simply time. The crowd sees what is. Vision sees what could be. And if you're watching this right now, sitting on a dream that everyone else thinks is crazy, remember the old farmer who bought 50 plots beside a struggling bank. For 12 years, people laughed. Then one day they stopped. Because time has a way of revealing what faith already knows.